Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Wednesday, September 27th, 2023. And today in history, September 27th, is not only the birthday of Samuel Adams in 1722, but also the same day in 1774, the Boston Committee of Correspondence, which Samuel Adams helped establish, and I think a couple of years prior to that, passed a resolution along with a dozen neighboring towns that expressly called on the people living there to take action against people, we'll call them collaborators, people who supported the British. And just to kick this off, I know if you're anything like me, when you think about, well, the Patriots and the old revolutionaries, how did they deal with collaborators? The first thing that comes to my mind, of course, is tarring and feathering. Now, it didn't really happen. It absolutely did happen. They did do this, especially after 1767 and the Townshend Acts. But it didn't happen as often as one might think. Maybe a dozen or so times, I believe, recorded before 1770. Certainly more after that date, but it wasn't a constant thing. And just a quick introduction to this show isn't going to be about tarring and feathering, but I wanted to cover this because I thought it was really interesting. Here's a quick overview from the American Battlefield Trust at battlefields.org of that process. And they said, first, they would strip the person of their clothes. And this was done to humiliate and intimidate people who were basically causing significant problems. They use this very aggressive approach to basically scare them off, and it could be very effective. Next, they would pour or brush hot pine tar all over the body. Now, pine tar, they write, was not as hot as modern petroleum-based tar when heated, but it would often blister or burn the skin. This is a version of torture, really. While pouring the tar on the skin was extremely painful, the punishment was not meant to be deadly, and no one was known to have been killed as a result of tarring and feathering. They would then cover this tar with feathers, resulting in the person having the humiliating appearance of a chicken or a large bird. On at least one occasion, they even lit some of the feathers on fire. We know that was recorded. But the person would then often be placed on a cart or forced to sit on a wooden rail and then would be paraded through the streets of the town to make a mockery of them. They did not mess around with the collaborators. That's the short version. This is the most aggressive thing I think that they really did in this episode, at least. Now, over at the Journal of American Revolution, allthingsliberty.com, J.L. Bell, who's one of my favorite historians of the period, if not my number one, probably the best researcher. He has an awesome article covering 5 big myths about tarring and feathering. If you're watching the video, you can see this might have been a Trumbull painting, but you get an idea of what's going on. Someone is basically tied up and they've been tarred and feathered. They are probably not doing too well. But some of the myths are that some people believe that this was fatal. There is no recorded evidence of it ever killing someone. Or 2, it was invented in Boston. Absolutely not. It goes way back. And I think the first instance in the colonies was actually in Virginia, although it became more popular in Boston. And third, that it ended with the Treaty of Paris at the end of the War for Independence, but it certainly did continue on for some time. But if you want to read all of the other ones as well, that will be linked to in the show notes a couple hours after this live stream is done at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. But let's get to those resolutions passed today in history in September of 1774. But I first want to do a little background because they were in response to one of the coercive acts, what a lot of people today call the intolerable acts, which is not the correct word. I've trained myself to move away from that. No one called it the intolerable acts at the time, really. They were known as the coercive acts. But these resolutions in September 27, 1774 were specifically against the Boston Port Act. And here from History.com, they point out that on March 25th of that year, the Parliament passed the Port Act, closing the port of Boston and demanding that the city's residents, get this, pay for the nearly $1 million worth in today's money, probably more than that since this was written with the inflation, but side note, the $1 million worth of tea dumped into Boston Harbor during the Tea Party of December 16, 1773. So we can go through the entire history of what led up to that, but it basically The short version: British restrict rights, British have a standing army, British have massive taxes to pay for all this at a war, and there's increasing resistance to it and then increasing pressure on the people to stop resistance. They really wanted to force compliance. That led to the Tea Party, and then we have the Coercive Acts in response to that. And one of the most hated one was that Boston Port Act. Over here at the American Revolution, they point out, this is called Our American Revolution, the Coercive Act, the only one intended solely as a punitive measure. So the only thing that the Boston Port Act was doing was punishing people, and it was intended that way. It was designed to close Boston Harbor to, quote, the landing and discharging, lading or shipping of goods, wares, and merchandise. It was effective June 1st, 1774. Now, we may have not had a blockade on our cities from the so-called federal government, but certainly there has been all kinds of shutdowns that we've had to experience, maybe not to the same degree as a wartime measure, but certainly we still experience these types of things under the empire today. It also removed, here again from Our American Revolution, it also removed all customs officials from Boston to Salem. The preamble claimed the legislation was necessary because, quote, dangerous commotions and insurrections have been fomented and raised by diverse ill-affected persons, to the subversion of His Majesty's government and to the utter destruction of the public peace. So standing up for your rights against arbitrary power is, of course, considered dangerous. And governments will always do this, and that's basically what they were doing. And we know that later this year in 1774, because of the resistance, General Gage and Lord Dartmouth and others really started trying to implement a total gun control regime because they did not want the people to be able to stand up for themselves. And this is the kind of the path that governments go through. So the Boston Port Act. Here's Samuel Adams, in a letter to John Dickinson in April of 1774. He says, I take the liberty to enclose an oration delivered on the last anniversary of the 5th of March, 1770 by Mr. Hancock. We know that in Boston they had kind of a solemn commemoration of the massacre in Boston every year, and they would have an event, and there would be a keynote speaker each year, and this particular year it was John Hancock. I cover one of these speeches basically every year on this podcast. Now, at some point, I'm going to run out of them. But Hancock's I thought was pretty awesome. People didn't think he was going to do all that awesome. I guess he wasn't known as a great public speaker, but somehow he pulled it together and was awesome. Even John Adams, who was concerned about it, thought he did an amazing job. But Samuel Adams is writing to Dickinson in context of, he's writing to him, I think probably in Philadelphia, Boston to Philly. And he, in context of this Boston Port Act that's coming and what they know is going to be used to enforce it. He said, I beg you to accept this oration as a token of my great regard for you. This institution, in a great measure, answers the design of it, which is to preserve in the minds of the people a lively sense of the danger of standing armies. If you think about what Hancock was talking about in March of 1774, referencing the massacre in Boston, the problem was the standing armies. And they know that if the port is going to be shut down in June, there's going to be a standing army to help enforce it. This is part of a long-standing American and even English tradition of hatred and opposition to permanent standing armies. He said, we are again threatened with that great evil. Samuel Adams, the father of the American Revolution, called standing armies a great evil. The British ministry being highly provoked at the conduct of the people here in destroying the East India Company's tea, which he may have had a little hand in, but we can go a little further. Here's a circular letter of the Boston Committee of Correspondence. We know that Samuel Adams made the original proposal for committees of correspondence in Boston in November of 1772. He also fired off very similar letters, similar to what I'm reading here. This was intended for Pennsylvania or a Philadelphia Committee of Correspondence, but they sent it out to a number of other areas and states. And he also fired off similar letters to people like James Warren, Silas Deane, Stephen Hopkins, Arthur Lee down in Virginia, Christopher Gadsden. So he was in contact with kind of the luminaries of the movement for liberty against the empire. But here, now, this wasn't just Samuel Adams writing this. Of course, he was very influential in those committees of correspondence at that time. He said, they have ordered our port to be entirely shut up. leaving us barely so much of the means of subsistence as to keep us from perishing with cold and hunger. And it is said that a fleet of British ships of war is to block up our harbor until we shall make restitution to the East India Company for the loss of their tea, which was destroyed therein the winter past. Obedience is paid to the laws and authority of Great Britain, and the revenue is duly collected. So it was pay $1 million worth to this company. The entire city, collective punishment. This is as nasty as you can get. Collective punishment. They have to pay back the East India Company, and then total obedience to the laws of Britain. And of course, we know that one of the things that John Hancock talked about in that Massacre Day oration is, hey, we've got this issue with standing armies. We've got this issue with taxation without representation. And of course, the armies coming to enforce this kind of stuff. But these are all just basically branches of the problem. They aren't the root. This isn't Hancock's phrase, but he said the underlying issue was, and he referenced specifically the Declaratory Act of 1766, where the British Parliament passed a law that said that the Parliament had power over the colonies in all cases whatsoever. So basically, total unlimited supremacy. It's similar to the twisted version of the supremacy clause that we have today that says the federal law is supreme when in pursuance of the Constitution, those very narrow delegated powers of the federal government in the Constitution. But instead, the supporters of the monster state today read it as federal law is always supreme until the federal government tells you that its own acts were not supreme, so you don't have to worry about it. To me, the difference in degree is so tiny between the unlimited power of today under the supremacy, this twisted version of the supremacy clause, and that Declaratory Act, which declared power over the colonies in all cases whatsoever. So if you have to have obedience to Great Britain, people understood that it was significantly beyond just paying a single tax or a single law. It was basically on your knee for anything and everything they may decide to throw at you at any time. And that was a line too far for anyone to cross at that time. This attack, though not made immediately upon us, is doubtless designed for every other colony who will not surrender their sacred rights and liberties into the hands of an infamous ministry. Thomas Paine once wrote that he who wants to keep, and this is my paraphrase, he wants to keep their own liberty secure must even guard their own enemy from oppression. Because as soon as government has power, this is a consistent theme on this show where I'm repeating the consistent theme from the founders and old revolutionaries. Once they establish a precedent to do something that they're not authorized to do, they will always use it in bigger ways. And even if they only use the precedent against a small number of people, they've established the power to use it against everyone else. This is the same argument that John Dickinson had against the New York Restraining Act in 1767, part of the Townsend Acts. He said, look, this may not be affecting you in another colony, but if they can do it to New York, they can do it to everyone. So we have to stand together. It's a join or die kind of mentality. We have to stand together because when they attack one, to divide and thus to conquer, divide and destroy is how they go about this. So Samuel Adams is really pleading the same case, saying everybody's got to get on board with this. We may be struggling, and maybe he was thinking about it strategically. Maybe he was being honest and saying, hey, you guys got something to worry about, but he certainly wanted support for the people of Boston. He said, be assured you will be called upon to surrender your rights if they should succeed in their attempts to suppress the spirit of liberty here. This is what empires always do. So on June 1st, they immediately shut down the port. And it was probably pretty easy for the Royal Navy. And here from Wikipedia, Royal Navy warships subsequently began patrols at the mouth of Boston Harbor. To enforce the acts, they closed down Charleston as well. The British Army also joined in enforcing the blockade, and Boston was filled with troops led by Commander-in-Chief Thomas Gage. Samuel Adams, Boston Committee of Correspondence, they knew what was coming. Everybody probably knew what was coming. The British were coming with regular troops, a standing army, that great evil, to attack the people there. June 1st was widely observed as a day of fasting and prayer. And I'm not sure if this was an ongoing thing, because they certainly did this to commemorate the massacre in Boston for many years, maybe 8, 9, 10 years. I forget when they stopped doing it. But they commemorated this for many years. And they also did I guess, June 1st. I'm not sure if this was a repeating annual one, but they certainly observed it as a day of fasting and prayer, bells being tolled, flags placed at half-mast, and houses draped in mourning. And here, shortly after it was passed, there was, they shut down the port, but we know that there were a few good smugglers on the Patriot side. And here's Samuel Adams writing to his friend down in Virginia, Richard Henry Lee. They were great friends. Pauline Mayer has an awesome book that covers it. The name of the book, actually, I can't remember it, but she does some really good history, or she did before she passed. But here's a letter to Richard Henry Lee on July 15th. So they shut down the port on the 1st. They sent in the troops at that time. But here is Samuel Adams. He said, "The unrighteous and oppressive act of the British Parliament for shutting up this harbor, although executed with a rigor beyond the intent even of the framers of it, has hitherto failed. And I believe he will continue to fail of the effect which the enemies of America flattered themselves it would have." Now, this is a kind of a hint to what we're getting at in this show. How did they treat collaborators? It's enemies. They are enemies of America. If you are shutting down commerce, they are treated, if you have a standing army, you are an enemy of America. And we have all of that kind of stuff today, but people aren't treating those who implement it and their supporters, their collaborators, as enemies. So again, these Samuel Adams, and I am not a student of the day by day how this went down after the Boston port was shut down. Now, was Samuel Adams hyping things up and saying that they were better than they were in order to get Richard Henry Lee and his crew down in Virginia on board in support? Or was he, giving them good news because it was really happening? I don't know. I know we have some really great students of history that send me feedback from time to time in the chat or in the archive comments or by email, team@10thamendmentcenter.com. So if you've got some insight on that, I would love to learn, or if you've got a recommendation of what I should read. He said, far from being, again, Samuel Adams to Richard Henry Lee, July 15th, 1774, far from being in the least degree intimidated, they are resolved to undergo the greatest hardships rather than submit in any instance to the tyrannical act. So ultimately, he's saying it doesn't matter how difficult it may be. If they are going to shut down our commerce, we are going to go through as much difficulty as we need to go through in order to break down their blockade. How many shutdowns do people need to go through before they take the same mentality today? Anyways, we're going to link to all this stuff. Alan Mosley's been doing amazing work putting together the blog posts on this, freeing up tons of time for me to work on additional projects and expand our reach. So I'm very grateful for Alan joining us on that. He's been working with us on a part-time basis, doing some contract work over the last couple of years. And so we'll have a blog post published for this episode like we do every single episode in the next couple of hours after this live stream is done. That's over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. And every single episode has not only all the different platforms are on, the video platforms, the audio-only podcast edition, but there's a show links section where you can see all the stuff, well, usually all the stuff that I'm mentioning. And I'm just pulling it up on the screen here. You'll see at the top, there's an overview of the episode. Then there's the audio player. There's a video version. And then there's a show links section. This way you can say, dude, where's that letter that Samuel Adams wrote to so-and-so? What was the date of it? Whatever it may be. If you want to read it in context and learn more on your own time, this is where all this stuff is going to be. And someday we're going to get better at organizing all this stuff, but doing our best to share as much information as possible. And while I'm here, I want to say a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat. A lot of activity out there today, it looks like. Bear with me just one moment. Here we go. Let me pull this up. There's Joseph and Kirk and Cheriton, Douglas, Senator DT, Lawrence Smith, Clay Kent, M. Gabriel, Dixie Strong, King Nobody, Joseph Bonamolo, Lonnie Hall, and everyone else. There's Haji and a few others. I know I'm skipping over a few people here as I'm scrolling through, but I really appreciate you guys being here. Whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one, over 4 years, maybe 5. I don't even know. It's hard to keep track. I enjoy doing this. And every time I do one of these episodes, most every single one, I'm learning new stuff because I'm doing the research the day before to organize my notes for it. I have some interesting stuff that we've published sometimes. Maybe sometimes I've even taken something that I don't know much about at all, and I'm learning a completely different thing about it because I've done the research in order to organize this, and I'm just trying to share what I'm learning with you. And so I'm glad that you're spending some time with me and you find this niche history as interesting as I do. Anyways, let's get back to it. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. So the First Continental Congress was actually convened in Philadelphia in September of 1774 specifically to coordinate a colonial response to the Port Act and the other coercive acts. So Samuel Adams' letter-writing campaign must have been pretty effective, or just people just recognized this mentality, because John Dickinson's Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, which were the most widely read documents on American liberty at that time up until 1776, everyone read this stuff, and he was already publishing the view that if you attack one colony, the people of one colony, they have the power to attack everyone else. So this was a widely accepted view. So I'm not sure what the motivation was, but certainly they were very much alarmed, and they coordinated, the First Continental Congress specifically to respond to the Coercive Acts. And here from Wikipedia, they say, as a prelude to its decisions, the Continental Congress's first action was the adoption of the Suffolk Resolves, a measure drawn up by several counties in Massachusetts that included a declaration. Now, they understate what was put in there, and they definitely don't include everything that they called to do in the Suffolk Resolves. We shouldn't be surprised that Wiki kind of excludes the most aggressive stuff. Maybe they don't want people to learn this. I don't know. It was a measure drawn up by several counties in Massachusetts that included a declaration of grievances, called for a trade boycott of British goods, and urged each colony to set up and train its own militia. And here from an article that Mike Meharry wrote about it, he said, the committees of correspondence, again, if we're talking about Samuel Adams, in November of 1772, he made the motion, or he called to organize the Boston Committee of Correspondence. And I believe he wrote to Joseph Warren shortly after. Maybe it was James Warren, one of those guys. And there's a letter that I didn't include in the notes for today, but basically, and this is something that I had learned going through this as well, he was the guy who said, look, we have this thing here, but if we don't actually get these to spread where we can communicate widely and quickly with people in other areas, and Paul Revere actually carried a lot of these letters back and forth, if we don't do this all over the place, we're going to have real problems. So he was the kind of a very, very influential guy in setting this all up. So committees of correspondence from Suffolk, Middlesex, Essex, Worcester County in Massachusetts met in Boston to formulate a response to the Coercive Acts. The convention called on all of the counties to shut down their courts rather than submit to the British measures. So it wasn't just calling for a boycott. It was also shut down the courts. And then I also covered in a podcast on the Suffolk Resolves, it called for direct noncompliance by the people, disobedience to courts if they stayed open, and even tax resistance. So this was a pretty aggressive measure that they don't really teach about, but we look at it as kind of a blueprint for liberty, and that's the name of that episode that I covered on it. It will be included in the show notes. I do encourage you to check it out. So Samuel Adams writes to Charles Chauncey on September 19th, and he points out that last Friday, Mr. Revere, Paul Revere, took those Suffolk Resolves, wrote them to Philadelphia, where Samuel Adams and others were meeting as part of the First Continental Congress to organize resistance or a response to the Coercive Acts, the Boston Port Act. He said, Mr. Revere brought us the spirited and patriotic resolves of your county of Suffolk. We laid them before the Congress. They were read with great applause, and the enclosed resolutions were unanimously passed, which give you a faint idea of the spirit of the Congress. So the Continental Congress was generally seen as more slow-moving and less aggressive, we'll say, than some of the more local resolutions against the British. But here, the First Continental Congress, the first thing that they passed was unanimous support for the Suffolk Resolves, which called for noncompliance, straight-up disobedience, even tax resistance. So this is pretty hardcore stuff. Of course, I never learned about it when I was growing up in school, because why would anyone want to teach you how to defeat the empire in a government-run school? Anyway, so a few days later, he sends off another letter to Joseph Warren. This is Samuel Adams. On September 25th, he said, I spent yesterday afternoon and evening with Mr. Dickinson. He is a true Bostonian. That's a pretty good review, a pretty good rating by Samuel Adams of John Dickinson. It is his opinion that if Boston can safely remain on the defensive, the liberties of America, which that town have so nobly contended for, will be secured. But there is a line in the sand where it's no longer defensive and you have to be more aggressive. He said the Congress have, in the resolve of the 17th, given their sanctions to the resolutions of the county of Suffolk, which were drafted primarily by Joseph Warren, one of which is to act merely on defensive. So one of the resolves is act just on the defensive, so long as such conduct may be justified by reason and the principles of self-preservation, but no longer, and he put no longer in all caps. So he's really emphasizing that as long as it's just a defensive response, and we can, go with reason and the principles of self-preservation. But as soon as they go beyond that line, you don't have to only be on the defensive. So they were ready to step it up as needed. And we know that's basically what happened in the months to follow. Mike Meharry points out then on September 27th, a meeting of, quote, the several committees of the towns of Boston, Roxbury, Dorchester, I don't know how to say some of these names, I'm sorry, Watertown, Charleston, Cambridge, Mystic, Dedham, Mystic, the river that the British troops sailed up the British, they sailed up the Mystic River the morning of April 19th, 1775 to Lexington and Concord. Dedham, Milton, Malden, Braintree, Woburn, and Staw, they passed a resolution condemning any person helping the British military in its occupation of Boston. And here, in that actual resolution that was approved by Boston and those 12 other towns, this will be linked to in the show notes as well, so you can read it in full. It's not very long, but they point out that, well, we're having some problems here because of this Boston Port Act. They say the inhabitants of the towns of Boston and Charleston, by the operation of the detested and oppressive Port Bill, are now suffering unspeakable distress, arising from the entire prohibition of commerce and the transportation of even necessaries of life by water from one town to another. Think about that. Prohibition of commerce. Now, this was entire prohibition of commerce, and maybe we haven't experienced it completely today, but I wouldn't be surprised to see them try to implement. They've had versions of this. Of course, they prohibit commerce in various items, various agricultural items, whether it's a plant you can grow in your backyard or a milk that you decide not to pasteurize. They do prohibit it going from one state to another. They do this with various tools of self-defense. All kinds of things are prohibited in commerce. And they've gotten much more aggressive with shutting things down for emergency reasons, and I don't think we should be surprised if we see more of that today. But this is how they responded to a shutdown of commerce. General Gage, they say, the military commander of this province, and the admiral on this station are now in exercise of the most licentious and arbitrary acts of oppression. You might be familiar with the term arbitrary because that's listed as one of the injuries and usurpations, what we call grievances. In the Declaration of Independence, arbitrary powers, when they just do what they want. It doesn't matter what the rules given to government. They just do whatever they want. Now, of course, that's what government does as long as people let them get away with it. And they say that, they've caused problems by alarming the people with the most formidable fortifications at the entrance of the town, by continuing and increasing their apprehensions with the design of erecting batteries and pickets to surround the town, thereby to awe and intimidate, if not to subjugate the inhabitants to a tame and unresisting state of servitude. That's how empires treat people who try to get out of line by exercising their rights, whether the government gives them permission to or not. So when people want to advance liberty today, we have to recognize that government will try to do some very aggressive things as long as there isn't enough people to respond to it. Having that mentality that Samuel Adams was talking about to Richard Henry Lee. We've got people who are like, we're going to go through whatever we need to go through to break through this blockade, and we're going to stand, we'll go through whatever hardships rather than bend the knee. So it's important to point out that they had a little bit of an attitude about how this went down and how people should be treated. And this is kind of a long piece here, but hopefully it'll kick in and make sense as to why I'm including this. Should any person or persons, well, first of all, should any person or persons, this is the final resolve in this short document, should any person or persons, inhabitants of this or the neighboring provinces, any neighboring province, supply the troops now stationed in the town of Boston, acting in open hostility to the persons and properties of the inhabitants with labor, lumber, joists, spars, pickets, straw, bricks, or any materials whatsoever, which may furnish them with requisites to annoy or in any way distress said inhabitant. So basically, material support or resources. This is a term that they use in the Patriot Act. Is a very broad legal term that they use today. So basically, if you provide material support or resources, they can consider you doing something bad, and they're going to try to stop you. But we also use this in some of our model legislation to defeat federal programs, like turning off water and electricity to the NSA data centers in places like Utah and Texas and elsewhere. Anybody helping provide material support or resources to the empire, well, they should run into some problems as well. Anyway, so anyone does this, he or they so offending shall be held in the highest detestation, be deemed the most inveterate enemies of this people, and ought to be prevented, opposed, and defeated by all reasonable means whatsoever. So anyone who is a collaborator, now this wasn't a law passed. They didn't need to do this. They didn't need to require people to treat the British as enemies. They just had to pass a resolution saying, hey, this is the view of the representatives of the people of these 13 towns. And the people in general were heavily on board with this. Of course, there are some outliers. That's why they're including this. They're encouraging people to say, if you find out that someone is helping the British, you should treat them as an enemy of the people here. And whatever they're doing ought to be prevented, opposed, and defeated by all reasonable means whatsoever. And that really kind of is in the eyes of the beholder in the situation at hand. What does that mean? It is pretty open-ended. And I think if you take that in consideration with what Samuel Adams was saying, hey, we're going to only do the line of defense unless they go beyond it. And I think that kind of ties in pretty well as well there. Now, this is not the only time that resolutions were passed saying collaborators were to be treated as enemies of the people. Here in the Solemn League and Covenant, also drafted by Joseph Warren, this is in July of 1774, he says, and in order as much as in us lies to prevent our being interrupted and defeated in this only peaceable measure, noncompliance, peaceful resistance to the Boston Port Act, entered into for the recovery and preservation of our rights, we agree to break off all trade, commerce, and dealings, whatever, with all persons who, preferring their own private interest to the salvation of their now perishing country, shall continue to import goods from Great Britain, or shall purchase of those who do import. So this was a local non-importation agreement that did kind of spill over to the First Continental Congress. We end up getting the Continental Association in August or October of 1774. It was a broad-based non-importation agreement among the colonies. But here, Joseph Warren is pushing it out early, saying, hey, we're not going to buy stuff, but anybody who collaborates with them, we're going to shut them out of business as well. If you even buy stuff from someone else, we're not going to do business with you. This was a very, very early, I guess, cancel culture in support of liberty in some ways. And then, of course, we have from the First Continental Congress that fall, they were there organizing, what are we going to do in response to these coercive acts, to the Boston Port Act? Well, one of the things that they passed was the Continental Association, one of the first four great documents of American liberty that we can call the Big Four, really. That was passed in October of 1774. And the 11th article in this called for a committee in every county, city, and town to basically monitor compliance with the non-importation agreement. And anyone who is found to violate the agreement, here from the 11th article, the truth of the case would be published in the local gazette, to the end that all such foes to the rights of British America may be publicly known and universally condemned as the enemies of American liberty, and thenceforth we respectively break off all dealings with him or her. So anyone who continues to violate this agreement, saying we're not going to import, we're not going to do business, we're going to break the back of the British economically, or we're going to at least make an effort, until they try to ramp it up in other ways, we will continue to do that. And anyone who violates that, we're going to be monitoring what's going on. And if they don't, there's actually a whole thing about they had to sign a document saying none of the stuff in my store, for example, comes from Britain. And if they're found out otherwise, man, we are going to really, really make it public. Everyone's going to know you're one of the bad guys. No one will do business with you. I don't even know if they say we will break off all dealings with him or her. Are they cutting him off from coming over for dinner? I don't know, but they certainly took this type of attitude. I don't think they were going to break bread with enemies of the liberty of America. Now, Wikipedia has an interesting point here about the enforcement of that Continental Association. They said it went into effect on December 1st, my birthday, 1774. Compliance with and support for the established boycott was largely enforced through local enforcement committees. By mid-1775, for example, a large majority of Virginia's 61 counties had set up their own committees. And the use of public pressure was an overwhelmingly effective tactic in enforcing support for the boycott. So this type of pressure, publicizing who the collaborators were and cutting off all dealings with them, was highly effective. Maybe it's something we should think about more and more here in modern times, because it works. Those who went against the boycott or even simply criticized the Continental Association would often find their names slandered. It's interesting that they put that term slandered, because it sounds like it's a negative. It was just a tool. Well, they were taking the wrong side. They would find their names slandered in newspapers and town gossip, often forcing those targeted to cave to pressure and publicly apologize. The threat of more direct action also played a role in forcing merchants to comply, with one merchant in Annapolis, Maryland, choosing to burn his own ship full of imported tea rather than attempt to sell it. So this type of boycotting, this type of boycott plus pressure, treating people who support the destruction of your liberty as the enemy of liberty, is really what they did. And I think that was an incredibly effective approach. Maybe there's something for us to learn about there today. I don't know. I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. If you want to help us get this kind of information, this kind of history out to more and more people, there is absolutely nothing that helps us do that work more every single day, more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat, please consider throwing it our way over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. While I'm here, I want to take a quick moment to say a huge thank you to just a handful of people who have joined us recently. There's Dennis in Maryland, Eddie in Texas, Alicia in New Mexico, David in Montana, and Jolene in Vermont. I'm grateful for all of you and everyone that I didn't name, all of our current members that I see out in the chat. I really appreciate your support. And if you can't join us financially, that's cool. We're going to continue doing the work that we need to do, and you can also help us spread the word by leaving reviews on Apple Podcasts, smashing the like button, subscribing, sharing stuff. All that stuff helps us reach and teach more people. I'm running a little bit longer than I expected to today, so I do have to bail, but I will actually look over in the live chat a little bit later today and tomorrow. You can also email me at team@10thamendmentcenter.com if you got questions, or if you got suggestions for future episode. I appreciate all your feedback. I appreciate you being here, and I hope to see you next time on the path to liberty.